At 03:15 hours on February 8, 1944, Sergeant Tommy Prince lay motionless in the frozen mud of an abandoned Italian farmhouse, 200 meters from a German artillery battery. He had been there for more than a day. Through a crack in the stone wall, he watched German soldiers move between their guns, unaware that an Ojibwe warrior from the Canadian prairies was counting their positions and relaying coordinates through 1,400 meters of telephone wire stretched back to Allied lines. Prince had not eaten. He had not slept. He had watched German patrols enter the farmhouse twice, hiding in the rafters while they searched the rooms below. The cold had seeped into his bones. His muscles ached from holding the same position for hours, but he remained still, watching, waiting, reporting every movement to the artillery officers who depended on his eyes. Now, as dawn approached on his second full day in position, an artillery shell landed nearby and severed his communication wire. The line went dead. Prince was alone, cut off, 200 meters from enemy soldiers who would kill him if they knew he was there. Prince had a choice: stay hidden and lose contact with his unit, or walk into the open, in full view of German soldiers, and repair the wire. What happened in the next 4 minutes would become one of the most audacious acts of deception in the Second World War, and it would cement the reputation of a unit that had already begun to haunt the nightmares of German soldiers across Italy. A unit the Germans called Die Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils. The story of how American and Canadian soldiers earned that name begins not on a battlefield, but in the mind of a British scientist with an idea so unconventional that most military planners dismissed it as fantasy. In the spring of 1942, Geoffrey Pike worked for the British Combined Operations Command under Lord Louis Mountbatten. Pike was not a soldier, he was an inventor, an eccentric thinker known for proposals that ranged from brilliant to impossible. His latest idea fell somewhere in between. Pike envisioned a small, elite force capable of striking behind enemy lines in the most hostile conditions imaginable: winter warfare in Norway, sabotage missions in the frozen mountains of occupied Europe, attacks on hydroelectric plants and industrial facilities that conventional forces could never reach. The concept was audacious: a commando unit that could parachute into enemy territory, survive in temperatures that would freeze ordinary soldiers, climb mountains that blocked conventional armies, and fight with tactics that no enemy had encountered before. The force would need to operate in sub-zero temperatures for extended periods. They would need to ski across wilderness, scale vertical cliffs, paddle inflatable boats through freezing waters, and destroy targets miles behind enemy lines. They would work in small units without support, relying entirely on their training and each other. Prime Minister Winston Churchill approved the concept. Churchill had always favoured unconventional warfare. He had championed the creation of British commando units and encouraged any idea that might strike at the enemy in unexpected ways. But the British lacked the manpower to create such a specialised force alone. They approached the Americans with a proposal: a joint commando unit, half American and half Canadian, trained for operations that no conventional army could attempt. The idea landed on the desk of a young American officer in the War Department. His name was Robert Frederick. He was 35 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the Coast Artillery, with no combat experience and no particular reputation for unconventional thinking. He had been assigned to the Operations Division, handling matters that involved multiple theatres of war. Frederick spent 12 days studying Pike's proposal. He analysed the terrain in Norway, calculated the logistics of parachuting men and equipment into occupied territory, examined the challenges of winter warfare in conditions that would kill unprepared soldiers within hours. He wrote a 14-page report, single-spaced, with maps and appendices. His conclusion was clear: the operation was impractical, the risks were too high, the logistics were impossible, the plan should be abandoned. General Dwight Eisenhower read Frederick's report carefully. Then he made an unexpected decision. He told Frederick that since he understood the concept so thoroughly, since he had identified every problem and every challenge, he would be the perfect officer to make it work. Frederick would create the force, train it, and command it. Frederick was stunned. He had written the report to kill the project. Instead, he had been handed the most unusual command in the American military. On July 9, 1942, The 1st Special Service Force was officially activated at Fort William Henry Harrison, near Helena, Montana. The name itself was deliberately misleading. Special Service suggested entertainment troops, soldiers who performed shows to boost morale. Frederick hoped the innocuous designation would confuse enemy intelligence about the unit's true purpose. The location was chosen deliberately and carefully. The wide, flat valley around Helena provided open space for parachute training, with gentle terrain that would reduce injuries during practice jumps. The surrounding mountains, some reaching 9,000 feet, offered terrain for climbing and winter warfare instruction. Steep cliffs, rocky slopes, and alpine conditions would test the men in exactly the environment they would face in combat, and the brutal Montana winters would prepare them for Norway. Temperatures in Helena regularly plunged well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow accumulated for months. The wind cut through clothing and exposed flesh. If men could survive and fight in Montana in January, they could survive and fight anywhere. Frederick faced an immediate problem. He needed 1,800 soldiers with specific backgrounds, men who could survive in wilderness conditions, men who could navigate without roads or trails, men who could endure hardship that would break ordinary soldiers, and he needed them immediately. Recruitment advertisements went out to army posts across the United States and Canada. They asked for volunteers with experience as lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, game wardens, trappers, prospectors, and outdoorsmen. The advertisements made clear that the training would be dangerous and the missions would be hazardous. They wanted men who sought difficulty, not men who avoided it. The response exceeded expectations. Thousands applied from both countries. Frederick kept only 1 in 4 American volunteers, rejecting men who lacked the mental toughness or teamwork the missions would require. The Canadians proved exceptional. Many had already seen action at Dunkirk. They understood combat in ways that American volunteers did not. Nearly all were accepted. By August, the force was assembled. Approximately 1,800 combat troops, roughly 2/3 American and 1/3 Canadian, organized into 3 combat regiments and a service battalion. The regiments were numbered 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Each contained 2 battalions of 3 companies. The structure was deliberately flexible, designed to operate as a unified force or break into smaller units depending on mission requirements. From the beginning, Frederick made a decision that would define the unit's character. There would be no distinction between American and Canadian soldiers. They would train together, fight together, live together, and be treated as equals in every way. They would share barracks, share meals, share hardship. They would become one unit, not 2 nationalities serving together. This was unprecedented. No combined American and Canadian military unit had ever operated this way. National armies maintained their own chains of command, their own traditions, their own identities. Frederick was creating something new. A band of brothers drawn from 2 countries but bound by training and shared experience into something stronger than either nation could produce alone. The training that followed was unlike anything the American or Canadian armies had ever attempted. It was designed to be brutal, to push men beyond what they believed they could endure, to break those who could be broken and forge the rest into something exceptional. Every man began parachute training within 48 hours of arrival. The abbreviated program compressed weeks of instruction into days. For most, it was their first jump. Some men refused. They were sent away. The force had no room for soldiers who could not conquer their own fear. Norwegian military instructors taught skiing and winter survival. The men practiced until they could match Norwegian army standards. They skied miles through mountain terrain, carrying weapons and equipment. They spent nights in snow caves when temperatures dropped far below 0. Mountain warfare instruction pushed them up cliffs that seemed impossible. They learned to scale vertical rock faces in darkness, to move heavy equipment up slopes that would stop conventional forces, to fight while hanging from ropes hundreds of feet above the ground. But it was the close combat training that would make them feared above all else. A martial arts expert named Dermot O'Neill arrived to teach techniques that most soldiers never learned. O'Neill had served with the Shanghai International Police, where he had encountered the most brutal forms of hand-to-hand fighting. He had studied multiple martial arts and combined them into a system designed for one purpose: killing. O'Neill showed the men how to approach silently, how to neutralize sentries without sound. He taught them to strike vital points, to break bones, to crush windpipes, to kill quickly and efficiently with hands and feet. He showed them that a trained man was a weapon even when he carried no weapons at all. The training was brutal. Injuries were common. But those who remained emerged, transformed, forged into something harder than ordinary soldiers. Frederick himself helped design a weapon for the force. The V-42 stiletto was a fighting knife with a 7 5/16" blade, double-edged and hollow ground, designed for killing silently at close range. The blade could punch through a steel helmet with a single thrust. The pommel ended in a point that could crush a skull. Every man in the combat regiments received one and trained extensively in its use. The men also learned to use enemy weapons with the same proficiency they used their own. They disassembled and fired German rifles, machine guns, pistols, and submachine guns until they could operate them as effectively as weapons they had trained with for months. They studied German hand grenades, German explosives, German communications equipment. The logic was simple. Behind enemy lines, they might capture German weapons and need to use them. They might run out of American ammunition but find German supplies. They needed to be equally dangerous, regardless of what they carried. They studied German tactics, German command structures, German weaknesses. They learned how German units communicated, how German officers thought, how German soldiers reacted under pressure. Know your enemy was not just a slogan. It was a survival requirement. The training continued for months, each phase building on the last. Physical conditioning pushed men to exhaustion and beyond. Classroom instruction taught them languages, map reading, intelligence gathering. Field exercises combined everything into simulated missions that tested every skill they had learned. The men who survived the training formed bonds that would last the rest of their lives. They had suffered together, bled together, pushed each other beyond limits they had not known they possessed. They trusted each other with their lives because they had already depended on each other through months of brutal preparation. During the 9 months at Fort Harrison, the citizens of Helena adopted the force. Unlike larger military towns that sometimes resented the disruption soldiers brought, Helena welcomed these unusual men into homes and families. The townspeople invited them to dinners, to church services, to dances. They treated them not as temporary occupants but as members of the community. Some 40 of the original force members would return to Montana after the war to marry local women and build lives in the community that had embraced them. The connection between the force and Helena remained strong for decades, a bond forged in the months before they went to war. But the mission they had trained for would never happen. The planned attack on Norwegian hydroelectric plants was cancelled in the summer of 1943. Political considerations, changing strategic priorities, and the difficulty of maintaining the force behind enemy lines for extended operations led to the operation being scrubbed before it could begin. The 1st Special Service Force had become a unit without a purpose. They had trained for a specific mission that no longer existed. They were the most intensively prepared soldiers in the Allied armies, specialists in a form of warfare that apparently had no immediate application. Military bureaucracy threatened to break them up and disperse their skills across conventional units. Staff officers who did not understand unconventional warfare saw the force as an expensive anomaly that should be dissolved. The men who had endured months of brutal training faced the prospect of being scattered to regular infantry divisions where their special capabilities would be wasted. Then, in the autumn of 1943, the commander of the 5th United States Army in Italy made a request that would change everything. Lieutenant General Mark Clark faced a problem that conventional forces could not solve. His army was stalled in southern Italy, blocked by a German defensive line that stretched across the mountainous peninsula. The terrain itself was the enemy's greatest ally. Ridges and peaks channeled any advance into killing grounds covered by German guns. Every valley was a trap. Every approach was registered for artillery fire. At the center of that line stood a peak called Monte la Difensa. The mountain rose 3,000 feet above the surrounding terrain. Its slopes were covered with fortified positions, machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, and artillery emplacements. The Germans of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division had positioned their defenses to cover every approach, every trail, every possible route of attack. They had months to prepare, digging deep positions into rock, laying wire, sighting weapons. The 3rd Infantry Division had tried to take the mountain in November. They attacked with courage and determination. They pushed up slopes, swept by machine gun fire and artillery. They suffered terrible casualties. After 10 brutal days of fighting, they had gained nothing. The German positions remained intact. The dead and wounded were evacuated, and the division pulled back to reorganize. Other units attacked nearby positions along the winter line and were thrown back with heavy casualties. The conventional approach was not working. The terrain gave every advantage to the defenders. Frontal assault against prepared positions in mountains meant slaughter. Clark needed something unconventional. He needed soldiers who could do what regular infantry could not. He needed men who could go where the Germans believed no one could go. The 1st Special Service Force arrived in Naples on November 19, 1943. They disembarked from transport ships into a city that bore the scars of war. Buildings had been bombed, streets were rubble. Civilians struggled to survive amid the destruction. The men of the force saw immediately that they had left training behind. This was real. Within days, Colonel Frederick was studying the terrain around Monte la Difensa, looking for a weakness the Germans had overlooked. He flew aerial reconnaissance missions, examining the mountain from every angle. He sent scouts forward to observe the German positions. He analyzed every scrap of intelligence available. He found it on the north face of the mountain. The Germans had positioned their defenses to cover the obvious routes of attack, the slopes and trails that conventional forces would use. They had dug bunkers and fighting positions facing south, southeast, and southwest. They had laid wire and registered artillery to destroy any force approaching from those directions. They had largely ignored the north face because it was a sheer cliff, a vertical wall of rock rising hundreds of feet above a narrow approach. No sane commander would attempt to climb that cliff under fire. No conventional force could move heavy weapons up such terrain. The Germans had posted only token observation on the north face, confident that the terrain itself was defense enough. Frederick decided to climb it anyway. The assault was planned with precision born from months of training. The 2nd Regiment would scale the north face during darkness, reaching the summit before dawn. They would attack the German positions from the rear, from a direction the defenders had never considered possible. Surprise would compensate for numbers. Speed would compensate for support. On the night of December 2nd, approximately 600 men from the 2nd Regiment moved into position at the base of Monte la Difensa. The commander was Lieutenant Colonel Don Williamson, a Canadian officer who had proven himself during training. The men carried weapons, ammunition, and climbing equipment. They wore soft-soled boots to reduce noise on rock. They had blackened their faces and hands with boot polish to disappear into the darkness. A massive artillery barrage preceded the assault. More than 75,000 rounds fell on the German positions, one of the largest concentrations of artillery fire in the Italian campaign to that point. The bombardment was intended to kill German defenders, but also to distract them, to keep their attention focused on the expected direction of attack, while the real assault approached from behind. At 1800 hours, the 2nd Regiment began to climb. The final approach required scaling a 1,000-foot cliff face in freezing rain. The men used ropes secured by lead climbers, pulling themselves up rock that was slick with water and ice. They moved in darkness, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. They felt for handholds, tested each foothold before committing weight, inched upward foot by foot. No shots were fired, no alarms were raised. The Germans in their bunkers faced south, watching for the conventional attack they expected. They did not imagine that 600 men were climbing the cliff at their backs. The climb took hours. Men's hands grew numb from cold and the strain of gripping wet rock. Equipment snagged on outcroppings, the weight of weapons and ammunition dragged at their bodies, but they kept climbing, driven by training that had prepared them for exactly this kind of ordeal. By dawn on December 3rd, the lead elements of the 2nd Regiment had reached the summit behind the German main positions. The Germans woke to find American and Canadian soldiers attacking from a direction they had never considered possible. Surprise was complete. The fighting was savage and close. In the confined spaces between bunkers and fighting positions, there was no room for maneuver. Men fought hand to hand, using rifles as clubs, pistols at point-blank range, knives and fists, and anything that could kill. Forcemen used their V-42 stilettos in the way they had been trained, thrusting into vital areas, killing silently when they could, fighting desperately when they had to. They cleared bunkers with grenades tossed through firing slits and doors. They killed German soldiers who emerged to fight, and German soldiers who tried to surrender before surrender was possible. The battle was a brutal close-quarters slaughter that lasted hours. The German defenders fought back desperately, but could not organize effective resistance. Their positions had been designed to face the other direction. Their communications were disrupted. They did not understand what was happening or where the enemy was coming from. Panicked defenders fired at shadows. Some broke and ran. Others died fighting in positions that had suddenly become death traps. Within hours, Monte la Difensa fell. The Fifth Army had expected the assault to take 2 or 3 days. The 1st Special Service Force captured the mountain in a single night. Allied commanders were astonished. The operation became an immediate legend within the Fifth Army. Nothing in the Italian campaign had demonstrated so dramatically what specially trained soldiers could achieve. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The force held the summit against German counterattacks for days. They were exposed on the mountaintop, battered by artillery from surrounding peaks still in German hands, unable to be resupplied except by men carrying equipment up the same cliff they had climbed in the assault. Cold, exhaustion, and enemy fire took a continuous toll. During the initial assault and the following week of fighting, the force suffered devastating casualties. 511 men were killed, wounded, missing, or evacuated from exhaustion and frostbite at La Difensa and the adjacent Monte la Difensa. The assault force from the 2nd Regiment suffered approximately 77% casualties. The dead were buried on the mountainside. The wounded were carried down the same cliff face they had climbed in darkness. Within days, the regiment that had captured the mountain could barely muster enough men to hold it. The force continued attacking. Monte la Difensa fell on December 9th, Monte Sammucro on Christmas Day, Radicosa on January 4th, Monte Maggio on January 6th, Monte Viciataro on January 8th. Each peak extracted its price in blood. Each victory opened the way for conventional forces to advance. At Monte Maggio, Frederick was wounded 3 times in a single action. A shell fragment struck his eye. Shrapnel hit his body. He continued to lead from the front, refusing evacuation until the objective was secured. He had his wounds bandaged and returned to command. He would not abandon his men while fighting continued. Frederick was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during those 3 days of fighting at Monte Maggio, from January 10th through January 13th. The citation praised his courage and leadership under fire. It did not mention that he had been wounded repeatedly and refused to leave. By the time the mountain campaign ended, the 1st Special Service Force had proven it could accomplish what conventional forces could not. They had cracked the German winter line. They had taken positions that had stopped entire divisions. They had demonstrated that unconventional soldiers using unconventional methods could achieve results impossible for regular infantry. But the crucible that would create their legend still lay ahead. The mountains had tested them. Anzio would forge their reputation forever. On February 1st, 1944, the force landed at Anzio. The Anzio beachhead was supposed to outflank the German positions, blocking the Allied advance on Rome. Operation Shingle had put American and British troops ashore, 70 miles behind the main German defensive line. The plan called for rapid exploitation, a drive inland that would threaten German communications and force them to withdraw or be cut off. Instead, it had become a trap. The initial landings met little resistance, but Allied commanders hesitated, consolidating their beachhead rather than pushing inland immediately. The Germans reacted with characteristic speed and aggression. They rushed reinforcements to contain the landing. Within days, German forces surrounded the beachhead on 3 sides, pinning the Allied troops against the sea. What had been planned as a stroke that would unlock Rome became a desperate defensive battle for survival. The Allies could not break out. The Germans could not push them into the sea. The fighting devolved into static trench warfare reminiscent of the First World War, with neither side able to gain significant ground. The 1st Special Service Force was assigned to hold the right flank of the beachhead along the Mussolini Canal. The canal was a drainage project that Benito Mussolini had ordered built in the 1920s to reclaim the Pontine marshes for agriculture. It cut through flat, featureless terrain, creating a barrier between Allied and German positions that both sides used as a defensive line. On paper, the force was responsible for 13 kilometers of front, 1/4 of the entire beachhead perimeter. This was the same length of line that the entire 3rd Infantry Division was holding elsewhere on the perimeter. A division numbered roughly 15,000 men. The 1st Special Service Force, already depleted from the mountain campaign, numbered perhaps 1,200. This was an impossible assignment by conventional standards. A single regiment, under strength and exhausted, was being asked to hold a sector that should have required 10 times as many men. Across the canal, German units included elements of the elite Hermann Göring Division, Panzer Grenadiers, who had fought on the Russian front, veterans of campaigns across Europe and North Africa. Colonel Frederick, now promoted to Brigadier General, understood that conventional defense would fail. He did not have enough men to hold the line against a determined German assault. He could not match the German firepower or numbers. Static defense meant waiting to be overwhelmed, so he changed the equation. Instead of defending, Frederick ordered his men to attack. Every night, patrols from the 1st Special Service Force crossed the Mussolini Canal and penetrated German positions. They moved in small groups, faces blackened with boot polish, until they blended with the darkness. They carried their V-42 stilettos and suppressed weapons. They came in silence, appearing where the Germans least expected them. The tactics were brutal and explicitly psychological. Patrols would slip past German sentries, timing movements to avoid guards, using terrain and darkness to approach positions undetected. They would enter enemy encampments where soldiers slept, killing silently with their knives, moving from sleeping figure to sleeping figure. Sometimes they killed everyone. Sometimes they deliberately left 1 or 2 men alive so survivors could tell the others what had happened. The terror of waking to find your comrades dead around you, killed without a sound while you slept, was more valuable than additional bodies. They would take boots, equipment, and documents, proving they had been there. A German soldier who woke to find his boots missing knew that the Black Devils had stood over him while he slept, close enough to touch, close enough to kill, and had chosen to let him live this time. Sometimes they would leave calling cards. General Frederick had stickers printed with the force's insignia, a red arrowhead with the letters USA and Canada written in white. Down the side ran a message in German, Das dicke Ende kommt noch. The literal translation was, the thick end is coming soon. The meaning was clearer. The worst is yet to come. Forcemen placed these stickers on the bodies of dead Germans, on equipment, on bunkers, on anything that would be found by soldiers who had not seen the raids. They left them in locations where discovery was certain, spreading fear through rumors and physical evidence. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers began to report seeing shadows that disappeared when they looked directly at them. They heard sounds in the night that preceded death. They found sentries with their throats cut, killed without a sound while supposedly on watch. They found comrades who had died in their sleep, V-42 wounds in their chests. They found the stickers and knew that the Black Devils had been among them. The Hermann Göring Division, one of Germany's elite formations, veterans of campaigns across multiple theatres, was forced to pull back its positions nearly a kilometre to avoid the nightly raids. They withdrew from defensible terrain, surrendered ground they had held for weeks, simply to put more distance between themselves and the men who came in darkness. German commanders offered a 10-day furlough, a significant reward in an army where leave was rare, to any soldier who could capture one of the Black Devils alive. They wanted prisoners to interrogate, to understand how these Americans and Canadians operated, to find weaknesses that could be exploited. None ever claimed the reward. The Black Devils did not surrender. They did not get captured. They came, they killed, and they vanished. Within weeks of the force taking over the Mussolini Canal sector, German morale in that area had collapsed. Soldiers who had fought in Russia during the brutal campaigns of the Eastern Front, who had faced Soviet attacks and survived, who had proven themselves in North Africa, in Greece, in France, wrote letters home expressing fear of the Americans and Canadians who came in the night with their knives. One letter, found on a German soldier killed near Anzio, read in part that he was being sent back to the beachhead and feared for his life. "The angels with dirty faces," he wrote, "are all around us in the night with their knives." The phrase "angels with dirty faces" referred to the blackened faces of the force members. The soldier knew he was going to die. He wrote to his girlfriend in Berlin to say goodbye. It was during this period that Sergeant Tommy Prince conducted the reconnaissance mission that would make him legendary. Prince was an Ojibwe from the Broken Head First Nation in Manitoba. He had grown up hunting and trapping in the Canadian wilderness, learning skills that his ancestors had practiced for generations. He could move through terrain without leaving a trace. He could track any animal. He could remain motionless for hours while prey moved within arm's reach. His father had been a chief. His grandfather had negotiated treaty rights with representatives of the Canadian Crown. His family had served in Canadian forces during previous conflicts. Tommy Prince carried a tradition of warrior service that stretched back generations before European contact. In the force, Prince found a home where his skills were valued. The abilities he had learned hunting elk and tracking wolves translated directly into the reconnaissance work the force required. He could observe enemy positions for days without being detected. He could infiltrate areas that other soldiers could not approach. He was, in the words of his commanders, a ghost. On February 8, 1944, Prince volunteered to establish a forward observation post. The mission was dangerous and potentially suicidal. He would position himself in an abandoned farmhouse only 200 meters from German artillery positions. From there, he would report their locations through a telephone wire run back to Allied lines, allowing artillery officers to target German guns with precision. The position was close enough that Prince could hear German soldiers talking, close enough that patrols would pass nearby multiple times per day, close enough that any mistake, any sound, any movement at the wrong moment would mean discovery and death. That night, Prince crawled 1,400 meters through no man's land, laying telephone wire and avoiding German patrols. He moved inches at a time when patrols were near, remaining motionless for long stretches if necessary. He reached the farmhouse and set up his observation post in the upper floor, where cracks in the walls gave him sightlines to the German guns. For the next day, Prince watched and reported. He counted guns, noted positions, tracked vehicle movements, estimated ammunition supplies, and relayed coordinates for Allied artillery strikes. He watched through cold hours as German soldiers moved within shouting distance of his hiding place. German batteries that had been pounding the Anzio beachhead began to fall silent as Allied shells found their marks. Guns that had killed American and British soldiers were destroyed based on coordinates whispered through a telephone wire by a man hiding 200 meters away. Twice, German patrols entered the farmhouse to search for a location that might serve as an observation post. Prince hid in the rafters, controlling his breathing, remaining absolutely still while soldiers searched the rooms below. They did not think to look up. They left. Prince climbed down and continued watching. Then a German artillery round landed nearby and cut his telephone wire. The line went dead. Prince was alone, cut off, surrounded by enemies who would kill him instantly if they knew he was there. Prince faced an impossible situation. He could stay hidden, preserve his life, and lose contact with his unit. The mission would be over. The information he could provide would be lost, but he would probably survive. Or he could expose himself to repair the wire, walk out into the open in view of German soldiers, try to fix the connection while enemies watched, almost certainly be spotted, almost certainly be killed. Prince found civilian clothes in the farmhouse, old trousers, a worn shirt, a hat that had belonged to the Italian farmer who had lived there before the war, drove everyone away. He dressed as a peasant, grabbed a hoe that leaned against the wall, and walked out into the open. German soldiers watched as the peasant shuffled along the field between the farmhouse and their positions. The old Italian appeared to be checking his crops, such as they were in wartime. He moved slowly, bent over, looking at the ground. Just another displaced farmer trying to salvage something from the destruction of war. The farmer stopped. He bent down. He appeared to be tying his shoe. The German soldiers watching saw nothing unusual. The old man fumbled with his footwear for a moment, then stood up. He looked at the German positions and shook his fist, apparently cursing the soldiers who had occupied his land. Then he looked toward the Allied lines and shook his fist in that direction too, cursing both sides for destroying his farm and his life. When a German patrol approached to question him, Prince continued his performance. He complained bitterly in broken Italian and gestures about the destruction of his property. He cursed the Germans for being there. He cursed the Allies for shelling. He demanded to know when the armies would leave so honest farmers could work in peace. The Germans laughed at the old man's fury. They waved him away. They had more important concerns than a displaced peasant mourning his ruined crops. Prince returned to the farmhouse and continued reporting until he completed his mission. By the time he withdrew, Allied artillery had destroyed multiple German batteries based on his coordinates. Over 100 vehicles and an unknown number of enemy soldiers had been eliminated because one man had the courage to walk into the open and pretend to tie his shoe while splicing a telephone wire under the eyes of German soldiers. Prince was awarded both the British Military Medal and the American Silver Star, becoming one of only 3 Canadians to receive both decorations during the Second World War. His citation for the military medal read in part that Sergeant Prince's courage and utter disregard for personal safety were an inspiration to his fellows and a marked credit to his unit. But the precise nature of his actions at Anzio and earlier at Monte could not be fully described in his citations. Revealing the techniques he used would have compromised operations that other force members were still conducting. The classified nature of special operations warfare meant that Prince's full accomplishments remained hidden for decades. Prince would later serve in the Korean War with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, fighting in the Battle of Kapyong and leading patrols behind Chinese lines. He spent his post-war life advocating for Indigenous rights in Canada, testifying before Parliament about the need to respect treaty obligations and improve conditions on reserves. He died on November 25, 1977, in Winnipeg. More than 500 people attended his funeral, including the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba and consuls from France, Italy, and the United States. Men from his First Nation chanted the death of a warrior song as he was lowered into his grave in Brookside Cemetery. In 2023, Tommy Prince was designated a National Historic Person by Parks Canada, recognizing his service as one of the most decorated Indigenous veterans in Canadian history. The 1st Special Service Force held the Mussolini Canal sector for 99 days without relief. During that time, they conducted constant offensive operations, never allowing the Germans a moment of peace. They killed and captured enemy soldiers while suffering their own steady stream of casualties. But they never failed a mission. They never lost ground. They never let the Germans rest. The diary entry that reportedly gave them their name was found on a German officer from the Hermann Göring Division. It described how the Black Devils seemed to be everywhere along the line, appearing without warning, striking without sound. Whether this specific diary existed exactly as described has been debated by historians. The story was repeated so often and in so many forms that tracing it to a specific document has proven difficult. Some accounts say the diary was found on a dead officer. Others say it was captured during a raid. The exact wording varies in different tellings. What cannot be debated is that German soldiers genuinely feared the force and used terms like Schwarzer Teufel and Schwarzer Teufel Brigade in their communications. Multiple German sources from the Anzio period reference the Black Devils. The terror was real. The tactical effect was measurable. German units facing the 1st Special Service Force behaved differently than they did elsewhere on the line. They were more cautious. They stayed farther from their front positions. They posted more sentries. They slept less deeply. And still the raids continued. Still the deaths accumulated. Still the stickers appeared. On June 4, 1944, the 1st Special Service Force became one of the first Allied units to enter Rome. The breakout from Anzio had finally succeeded in late May. American forces punched through German defensive lines and began the advance on the Italian capital. The Germans were withdrawing, fighting rearguard actions, destroying bridges, and mining roads to slow the Allied pursuit. General Frederick organized a fast-moving task force of armored vehicles and infantry to secure key bridges within Rome before the retreating Germans could destroy them. The bridges across the Tiber River were essential for continuing the advance northward. If the Germans demolished them, the pursuit would stall for days or weeks while engineers constructed replacements. Frederick's task force raced ahead of the main Allied columns. They drove through Italian towns where civilians waved and cheered, not stopping to celebrate, pressing forward toward the capital. When they encountered German rearguards, they engaged immediately, destroying resistance and continuing without pause. The force entered Rome on the evening of June 4th. They found German units still in the city, defending positions, destroying equipment they could not take with them. Street fighting erupted at multiple points as the force pushed toward the bridges. Frederick himself led from the front, as he always did. He rode in a half-track vehicle at the head of his column, personally directing the movement toward objectives. When his force encountered resistance, he was there to make decisions and lead the response. He was wounded 3 times during the drive into Rome. Early in the day, a shell fragment struck him. He had the wound bandaged and continued. Later, more shrapnel hit his body. He continued. At one bridge, fighting at close range, he was wounded again. This wound required 256 stitches to close the gash in his thigh. Frederick escaped from the field hospital to rejoin his men before the city was secured. He could not remain in a hospital bed while his soldiers fought. He returned to command, limping on a leg that should have kept him immobilized, and directed operations through the night. At one point, Frederick and a small group of soldiers reached a bridge, just as a German unit approached from the other side. The Germans apparently intended to cross and escape before the bridge was demolished. Frederick and his men engaged them in a firefight across the span. 5 Germans were killed. 6 were wounded. 11 were captured. The remainder fled. Frederick, already wounded twice that day and once at the bridge, continued leading his force through the night until all the assigned bridges were secure. Rome was the first Axis capital to fall to the Allies. The men who had climbed Monte la Difensa in darkness, who had terrorized German soldiers at Anzio, who had earned the name Black Devils, were among the first to walk its ancient streets as liberators. The Italian campaign had cost the 1st Special Service Force 374 killed and more than 1,200 wounded. But they had achieved what they were created to do. They had taken objectives that stopped conventional forces. They had created fear that disrupted German operations. They had proven that specially trained soldiers using unconventional methods could achieve results impossible for regular infantry. After Rome, the force was sent to southern Italy to prepare for its next mission. Operation Dragoon would open a second front against German forces in France. The 1st Special Service Force would once again go where others could not. On August 14, 1944, the force landed on the islands of Port-Cros and Île du Levant, small islands off the southern coast of France that guarded the approaches to the main invasion beaches. German garrisons held ancient forts on both islands. Those guns could fire on the invasion fleet if they were not neutralized. The force attacked both islands simultaneously. They scaled walls, fought through fortifications, and cleared German positions in brutal close-quarters fighting. 9 men were killed in action or died of wounds. But the islands fell, and the guns that could have devastated the invasion fleet were silenced. The force then advanced along the French Riviera toward the Italian border, fighting through towns and villages that had been under German occupation for 4 years. They moved fast, hitting German units before they could establish defensive positions, maintaining momentum that kept the enemy off balance. Near the village of Lescarine, on September 5th, they attacked and destroyed an entire German battalion. Nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers were killed or captured in a single day's fighting. The German retreat toward Italy accelerated. By early September, the force had reached the Franco-Italian border. They took up defensive positions in the mountains overlooking the Mediterranean, watching for any German attempt to counterattack through the passes. But by late 1944, the nature of the war had changed. The force was now being used for conventional operations, supported by tanks and artillery, given assignments that did not require their special skills. Casualties had depleted the original trained members. Replacements, however capable, had not received the same intensive preparation that made the original forcemen exceptional. Frederick, now a major general at age 37, making him one of the youngest generals in the American Army, had already been transferred to command the 1st Airborne Task Force. The man who had built the 1st Special Service Force from nothing was leading other soldiers in other operations. The force he had created was operating without its founding commander. More significantly, the Canadian Army faced a manpower crisis. The pool of replacements available for the force had shrunk as Canadian forces expanded elsewhere. The unique arrangement that had made the force possible, Canadian soldiers serving under American command, had become difficult to maintain as both armies needed every man they could muster. The decision was made to dissolve the force. On December 5, 1944, near the village of Menton on the Mediterranean coast of France, the 1st Special Service Force paraded one final time. The ceremony was both a celebration of what they had accomplished and a farewell to brothers who would never serve together again. The weather was cold. The men wore their combat uniforms. They formed up in a field near Villeneuve-Loubet, the same village they had fought to capture just months before. American and Canadian soldiers stood together one last time. The ceremony was brief. Speeches acknowledged what the force had achieved. The men were thanked for their service. And then the order came to dismiss. The Canadian members were directed to board trucks that would take them to depots where they would be reassigned to Canadian units. Most would join the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, where their jump training and combat experience would be valuable. Some would go to other Canadian formations preparing for the final campaigns in Europe. When the Canadians loaded onto those trucks, hardened combat veterans who had killed men with their bare hands broke down in tears. Americans ran alongside the departing vehicles, weeping openly for brothers they would never serve with again. The dissolution of the unit hit many members hard. One veteran later recalled that when the Canadians pulled out, some of the toughest sons of bitches he had ever known cried like children. They ran after the trucks with tears streaming down their faces. These were not soft men. They had climbed cliffs in darkness. They had killed German soldiers with knives. They had held ground against overwhelming odds for 99 days without relief. But saying goodbye to brothers who had shared everything with them for 2 years was more than some could bear. The American members were dispersed as well. Some went to airborne divisions as replacements, bringing their skills to units preparing for the final push into Germany. Others joined Ranger battalions. Still others formed the core of the 474th Infantry Regiment, which would serve with the Third Army and later perform occupation duty in Norway. The unit had existed for 2 years and 5 months from activation to dissolution. In 251 days of combat across multiple campaigns, the 1st Special Service Force suffered 2,314 casualties. This represented 134% of its authorized strength. The casualty rate exceeded the total size of the unit because replacements continuously filled positions vacated by the wounded and dead, only to become casualties themselves. The force captured approximately 7,000 prisoners through direct actions across all its campaigns. They accounted for approximately 12,000 German casualties. For every man they lost, they inflicted casualties many times over. The force achieved results far beyond what their numbers would suggest possible. They earned 5 United States campaign stars. They earned 8 Canadian battle honors. Every objective they were assigned, they took. The legacy of the 1st Special Service Force shaped the development of special operations in both the United States and Canada for generations to come. The United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, trace their lineage directly to the force. The Special Forces insignia incorporates crossed arrows, a design element taken from the original force shoulder patch. The V-42 stiletto appears in Special Forces heraldry to this day, acknowledging the weapon that made the Black Devils feared. Many of the techniques developed by the force became standard doctrine for special operations units. The emphasis on unconventional warfare, on psychological operations, on small unit tactics that achieved effects beyond their numbers, all trace back to the lessons learned in the mountains of Italy and on the Anzio beachhead. The Canadian Special Operations Regiment, part of Canadian Special Operations Forces Command, carries forward the same heritage. Their badges incorporate elements from the force's insignia. Their training builds on the foundation established by those first Canadian volunteers who went to Montana in 1942. Every year on December 5th, American and Canadian Special Operations soldiers gather to commemorate Menton Day, named for the village near where the force paraded for the last time. They hold ceremonies at military bases and special operations facilities. They lay wreaths at memorials. They share stories of what the Black Devils accomplished. Most importantly, they remember the men who proved that courage, training, and brotherhood could overcome impossible odds. General Frederick went on to command the 45th Infantry Division through the final campaigns in Europe. He led the Thunderbirds through the Rhineland, through Germany, into Bavaria. His division helped stop the German Nordwind offensive in January 1945. They liberated the Dachau concentration camp and saw firsthand the horrors of Nazi brutality. They captured Munich. Frederick parachuted into southern France with the 1st Airborne Task Force, despite wounds that had not fully healed. He landed on rocks that reopened his thigh injury. He tied a piece of parachute cord around his leg as a tourniquet and immediately began organizing his scattered forces. He was wounded a total of 8 times during the war, making him the most wounded general officer in the American military. He earned 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, a Silver Star, and 8 Purple Hearts. Senior officers who served with him considered him one of the finest combat leaders of the war. After the war, Frederick commanded various posts and schools before retiring. He died on November 29, 1970. He was buried at the National Cemetery at the Presidio of San Francisco. In 2021, the building housing the United States Army Special Operations Command History Office at Fort Bragg was named in his honor. The dedication ceremony fell on December 3rd, the anniversary of the assault on Monte la Difensa. In 2015, 70 years after the force was disbanded, the United States Congress awarded the first Special Service Force the Congressional Gold Medal. This is the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow, the same recognition given to George Washington in 1776. 42 surviving members attended the ceremony in Emancipation Hall at the United States Capitol Visitor Center. The youngest was in his late 80s. They had waited 7 decades for recognition that finally came. Speaker of the House John Boehner presented the medal. His voice broke with emotion as he spoke. "These men saved the free world," he said. "The force was so fearless that the enemy dubbed them the Devils." Eugene Gutierrez, a 94-year-old American veteran, accepted the medal on behalf of his brothers in arms. "It is great to be here," he said, "and it is great to be American. I want to thank everyone who undertook this very important and noble assignment to honor and recognize this most versatile and effective fighting unit from the USA and Canada." Charles Mann, a Canadian veteran, spoke for those who had served under different flags but shared the same bonds. "I must say I am most honored and humbled," he said, "and I thank you all for allowing me to speak on behalf of the force members present and the force men who are no longer with us. May they rest in peace." The German diary entry that reportedly named them the Black Devils may or may not exist in exactly the form that has been passed down through history. The story has been told so many times, in so many ways, that separating legend from documented fact has become difficult. Historians have searched for the original diary without conclusive success, but the fear it expressed was real. German soldiers in Italy genuinely believed they faced something beyond ordinary soldiers. They called them devils because they had no other word for men who appeared from darkness, killed without sound, and vanished before dawn. The first Special Service Force proved that unconventional warfare could succeed where conventional tactics failed. They demonstrated that small units of highly trained, motivated soldiers could achieve effects far beyond their numbers. They showed that courage and skill could overcome superior forces, difficult terrain, and impossible odds. But perhaps their greatest legacy was simpler than tactics or doctrine. They proved that Americans and Canadians, fighting side by side with no distinction between nations, could become brothers in a way that transcended borders. When those trucks pulled away from Menton on December 5, 1944, the men weeping on both sides were not mourning the end of a military unit. They were saying goodbye to family. They had trained together in Montana winters. They had climbed impossible cliffs together in Italian darkness. They had killed together and bled together and buried their dead together. The force had made them one. That bond never broke. For the rest of their lives, surviving force members held annual reunions, alternating between the United States and Canada. They traveled across continents to see each other. They told their children and grandchildren about the men they had served with. They remembered their brothers who did not come home. "The black devils are all around us every time we come into the line," the German diarist reportedly wrote. "And we never hear them come." Whether those exact words were ever written in a diary remains uncertain, but the sentiment they captured was real. They came in silence. They struck without warning. They left fear in their wake, and 80 years later, their legacy lives on in the Special Operations Forces of two nations, in the ceremonies held each December 5th, and in the Congressional Gold Medal that finally acknowledged what their enemies had known all along. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were something more. They were the Black Devils. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.